Hello guys, so I'm now in phase 4 as a software engineer. So basically what I've been able to undergo in my journey is I was able to understand software requirement as a software engineer learner, and I was able to understand the real definition of requirement engineering, that it is the process of the software requirement from the client to analyze and document, which is known as the requirement engineering. And then I was able to understand the software requirement engineering process, or the requirement engineering process, which is categorized in 4. We have the feasibility study, we have the requirements gathering, we have the SRS, which is the software requirement specification, and the software requirements validation. And then I was able to understand the feasibility study. Feasibility study simply means, as a software engineer learner, what we will undergo is that we will go on an in-depth detailed study to ensure, or to make sure we confirm our feasibility the software will be. So we focus towards the organization, and then we analyze the software product, and then we practically materialize it to understand the implementation, the cost constraint, and then the technical aspect, which is the usability, the maintainability, the productivity, and the integration and the ability of the software product. And then we proceed to the requirement gathering, understanding the fact that if the feasibility study is positive, then the next phase is forward, is to go about the gathering requirements, which involves the analyst and the engineer making a communication between the client and the end users to know the ideas, and then they are able to conclude of the features they will use in revolve around the software. And then the software requirement specification is basically about the requirements of the software in terms of the features, the speed recovery after crashing, the security, the quality, the limitation, and etc. And then we are able to understand that the user requirements is supposed to, have a general, it's expressed in a natural language basically, and that the technical requirement is actually expressed in a structured language, which is used inside the organization. And then the design description should be written in PCD code, and also the format of the forms are GUI screen print, and then conditional mathematical notation for DFDNS. Then we are able to understand, as a software engineer learner, which is the software requirement validation. How valid is the software product? So the requirement is going to be checked on the following: if it's going to be practically implemented, if the valid is going to be per functionality of the domain software. And we understand that for every category, this the domain of software is very essential, especially when it comes to the software. So if there are ambiguities, if it's complete, and if it can be demonstrated. And then I was able to understand the requirements elicitation process as a software engineer learner, and what it consists of. So it's like a diagram actually, and it consists of the requirement gathering, the organizing gathering, the negotiation and discussion, and then the documentation. So the requirement and gathering simply means that there will be a discussion with the clients and the end users to know their expectation of what they want to get from the software. And then we proceed to organizing the requirements, which means we put everything in priorities and arrange the requirements in order for the urgency and the conveniences and the importance of it. And then we negotiate and discuss, which means we involve our stakeholders. The stakeholders will be investing in the software product, and then we negotiate, and then requirements may be prioritized and reasonably compromised. And then these requirements will come from various stakeholders, basically to remove an ambiguity and conflict, to discuss for clarity and correctness. Unrealistic requirements are also compromised reasonably. And then we talked about the documentation. Remember, for the requirement engineering process, we explained that it's to analyze, and when it's analyzed, it's documented, which is the software, the requirement engineering. So the documentation will involve both the formal and the informal, the functional and the non-functional requirement, and it is documented and made available for the next phase. Then we talked about the requirement elicitation techniques, which, as a software engineer, how can we get feedbacks in regards to the phase of moving on to, the techniques, which is number one, we do interviews, we do surveys, we do questionnaires, we do task analysis. And the interviews basically is categorized in structured, non-structured, oral interviews, written interview, one-on-one interviews, and group interviews. Then the software is that we'll ask the organization to give us a feedback or make some queries in regards to what the requirement. And then the questionnaires is that we'll give some questions which are going to be collected and compiled in order for us to not leave anything unattended. Then the task analysis revolves around the engineers and the developer analyzing the operation for the system required, and then it also involves the client knowing about the software to perform some certain operation, and it needs to be studied. Requirements of proposed systems are collected, and then the domain analysis, which as I said, that every software fall into the domain categories. We cannot exclude it because expert people in the domain can be of great help to analyze general and specific requirements. Then we move to the brainstorming, which is still under the technique. The brainstorming is like an informal debate between the stakeholders and other people who will share their input of everything that revolves around the software. And then the prototyping. The prototyping is like building the user interface. It's like testing. It's like experiments. It's like creating a sample. And then when you create a sample, it's like a prototype. That sample is just to give a feedback, like the client to give a feedback to be assured whether they can proceed with this kind of software. So it's like a sample of exactly what we want to produce, and then the clients will give a feedback of it. Then observation, at the end of it, the team of experts would and the client's organization and workplace will observe the actual working of the existing installed system, which is like the sample, which we call the prototype, and observe the workflow, and then the execution of the process will be dealt. And then conclusions will be able to form the requirements from the software. So we have the characteristics of software requirement, which means it has to be clear, correct, consistent, coherent, comprehensible, modifiable, verifiable, prioritized, unambiguous, traceable, credible source. And then the software requirements, we are able to understand this categorized in functional requirement, non-functional requirement, user interface requirement, and software system analysis. And then we are able to understand the software metric and measures, which is the size metric, the complexity metrics, the quality metrics, the process metrics, and the resource metrics. So that is it on my understanding of phase 4 of software requirement. Thank you. And please, to wrap it up, if you have any gigs related to software engineering, I'm looking forward to it, whether local or international. My number is +234 8147480036. Please reach out to Software Engineering Interview. I'm always available. Thank you.